A man dies from what seem to be natural causes.
Hey, wake up! My husband's really sick. He got heat stroke yesterday, and now he's not waking up.
His condition continued to decline throughout the evening hours. He ultimately passed away.
At the time, it was felt that this was more a medical-related death.
But an autopsy reveals foul play.
When we got the tox screen back, the victim had a lethal dose of ethylene glycol in his system.
So ethylene glycol is mainly found in antifreeze and brake fluid.
In the garage, there was a beer bottle that was full of antifreeze.
I knew my dad didn't just pass away so easily like that.
But when investigators discover a family inheritance at stake, it leads them to a killer who'd do anything to keep it for themselves.
I was leaned over in the truck, and she come out with a big old knife and tried to stab me.
$17 million is a lot of money. I don't care who you are.
This all could have been prevented. He died over literally nothing.
On September 4th, 2023, police in Minot, North Dakota receive what appears to be a routine emergency call.
Our Minot Central Dispatch received a phone call from Kenoyer reporting that Stephen Riley was ill in their apartment.
My husband's really sick. He got heat stroke yesterday, and now he's not waking up. Hey, wake up! Come on, wake up!
She stated that he was lying on the floor and that he was breathing but abnormally, and she needed an ambulance.
I've got help on the way.
Officers and medical staff were all dispatched to their apartment to try to make contact and see what was going on.
61-year-old man was unconscious.
Is he in here?
Yeah, he's on the floor in here.
Is he alert?
Huh?
Is he alert?
No.
Is he breathing?
The apartment was very cluttered.
There was trash, piles of clothing. We had to just really step over and onto a bunch of things to kind of navigate through the apartment. They eventually come to the bedroom where they see Stephen Riley barely breathing.
Steve, can you hear me? Steve? Steve, can you hear me? Has he taken anything?
No. He drank beer yesterday. He was working on the truck.
Ina had mentioned to officers that she was trying to help Stephen by putting an ice compress on him to try to help cool him down from the heat stroke.
She said she tried to put him up on the bed and he fell off. Then that's when she decided to call for EMS.
By the time paramedics arrive, it's clear Stephen's condition is more serious than Ina thought.
He found him struggling to breathe, lying on the floor unresponsive.
His condition is very poor. They had to carry him out in a cot.
Stephen Riley.
Once he arrived to the hospital, they quickly realized that he needed a bed in the ICU. There were no beds available here, so he was flown down to Bismarck, North Dakota.
When they get there, Stephen is actually getting worse and goes into cardiac arrest several times. Doctors working on him constantly to bring him back to life.
He was in end organ failure. His body has just started shutting down.
Well, Stephen's condition continued to decline throughout the evening hours and the night hours into the morning hours of September 5th. Stephen ultimately passed away on September 5th at 8:32 in the morning.
My phone was blown up with messages and missed calls from some of my dad's friends. The doctors pronounced him dead over the phone to me. It was devastating. Felt like something was torn from you. So I just tried to stay as calm as I could and get the fastest flight over there.
Doctors are unable to give police a definitive cause of death, but they do find traces of drugs in Stephen's system.
He also tested positive for methamphetamines and had a known history of methamphetamine use prior to that. And at the time, it was felt that he likely suffered from a cardiac event complicated by the fact that he used methamphetamines.
There was nothing indicating that there was any kind of foul play or there was anything requiring law enforcement to get involved and begin an investigation.
But I knew my dad didn't just pass away so easily like that and so fast. I knew something was wrong and off from the start, and so I had requested an autopsy from the hospital. Shortly after that phone call with them, I had called the police station and tried to open a case for my dad. I just needed to figure out what was going on.
Stephen Riley was born August 25th, 1972 in Palm Springs, California. He was so premature, his parents weren't sure he would make it.
My brother was sort of a miracle baby. He was 4 pounds when he was born and made it into the newspaper for being so tiny.
Stephen not only survived, he thrived, eventually becoming the protective older brother of 2 sisters.
Having Stephen as an older brother, he was definitely in charge. He really looked after my sister and I, no matter what we did. He always made sure that we were safe. He was just that older brother that was very comforting in that way.
As Stephen grew older, he took pleasure in the simple joys of desert life.
He was really into mechanics a lot. We replaced his transmission like 3 times in his Camaro. He was always smiling. Always. Steve was one of the jokesters and funny guy to be around, and, just good old friend. He'd take the shirt off his back for you.
But by the time he turned 40, he'd already been married and divorced twice.
Steve was married to his first wife, Cheryl, and they have 2 sons together. And then he remarried to his second wife, Melissa, and they have 3 sons together. He was a really good daddy to them, but he wasn't the type of person that had, like visible depression issues or high anxiety or anything like that. I think he hid a lot of that, to be honest. I think that's where some substance abuse kicked in. Then I think he just got with a crowd of people that were doing that stuff, and, once you get in, it's hard to get out.
My dad, he had a problem with alcohol and also had a drug habit. My mom cut off all connection between us. I think she was just worried that she didn't want us to go into the wrong footsteps.
He went to jail and did some time. And then when he got out, he didn't have anywhere to go, ended up in a homeless shelter.
While living in the shelter, Stephen met the woman who would help him turn things around. Her name was Kenoyer.
Kenoyer was born May 27th, 1976. She grew up in Bellingham, Washington.
Ina was social and active in high school, but as with many teenagers growing up, Ina suffered some setbacks, which unfortunately caused her to kind of struggle through life.
Ina would tell me that she had a very tough childhood.
After high school, Ina struggled to find herself, going through various jobs.
Eventually, those setbacks led her to the homeless shelter, which is where she ended up meeting Stephen Riley.
They really bonded together because they both knew what it was like to have absolutely nothing.
Stephen and Ina fell in love, and in 2011, they decided to move to North Dakota.
Stephen had a friend here in North Dakota that let him stay till he got on his feet. Steve and Ina, they were always together. Always. Most of the time he would work on cars in the garage, and she'd be coming out bringing him coffee or something to eat.
Stephen and Ina looked from the outside like they were just any old happy couple living in Minot, North Dakota, living their daily lives.
Now, Stephen lies dead in a Bismarck hospital, and police think his complicated past might have caught up with him.
Stephen was a known user, and he probably wasn't taking the best care of himself. A lot of times, like in the summer heat, you're not drinking fluids, your body gets really hot and your organs start shutting down. And I think that's kind of what people thought happened.
At the time of the officer's arrival, you could see beer bottles throughout the living room. Other than that, there was no obvious signs that Stephen wasn't just intoxicated or that he had been drinking that day until we got another phone call from Kenoyer.
On September 5th, which was the day after our law enforcement had responded for the medical call, Ina had called 911 to report that Stephen's friend, Billy Burkhead, had shown up trying to steal Stephen's truck.
Where's the truck at? In the garage.
All right, let me just take a look at it. So what's going on with the truck?
Said you're gonna sell everything. I said, no, you ain't selling nothing.
Ina said Billy had broken into the garage, and she had voiced her concerns that she believes he killed Stephen. From an investigator standpoint, there was a whole lot more that needed to be looked at here, and that's when we officially stepped in to try to figure this all out.
Coming up, detectives question Billy's motives.
There was something of interest as far as a murder weapon. Is Billy trying to get in there to get rid of that?
But he points the finger at someone else.
When you say she's not likable.
If she don't get her way, she's bad.
Detectives in Minot, North Dakota agreed to open an investigation into the death of Stephen Riley after his girlfriend, Ina Kenoyer, alleged he may have been murdered. To their surprise, detectives learned the county coroner is already looking into the case.
At this point, we were notified that an autopsy had been ordered by Stephen's son, Ryan.
I was actually contacted by one of the ICU physicians that took care of him, and she recommended that we test for ethylene glycol poisoning as well. It was just a hunch that she had based off a lot of his symptoms that he presented with. Ethylene glycol is a very common substance, mainly found in antifreeze and brake fluid. It's a slow death over a 2 to 3 day period where they're basically just suffering from the toxic effects.
When we got the tox screen back from the medical examiner, the victim had a very lethal dose of ethylene glycol in his system. The typical lethal level of ethylene glycol is approximately 20 milligrams per deciliter. The level of ethylene glycol in Stephen's system was 33 milligrams per deciliter.
And that's when I knew that we had a homicide on our hands.
Ina has already given them the name of the person she suspects. Billy Burkhead.
After receiving the information from Ina that Billy had broken into the garage, well, maybe there was something of interest as far as a murder weapon, a vessel of some sort that maybe administered some sort of poison to him. And is Billy trying to get in there to get rid of that?
A search of the garage provides a valuable clue.
During the search, we found 2 jugs of antifreeze. One jug was completely empty. The other jug was approximately half full. They were both gallon jugs.
But also in the garage, there was a beer bottle that was full of a substance that we identified as potentially being antifreeze.
Inside the house, investigators find another possibility.
On an end table next to the couch, there was a Windex bottle. Typical item that you would have in your home, but not typically filled with a neon green substance that resembles antifreeze.
We found that Windex bottle, and that was huge for us. It was just in an unusual manner. It was open, there was no cap on it, and that bottle could have easily been knocked over and spilled.
Finding those items throughout the property, I was very confident that at least one of those items was going to potentially be how or where that ethylene glycol came from.
Police ask Billy Burkhead to come in for questioning.
Thanks for coming down. Appreciate it.
No problem.
We wanted to understand the relationship between Billy and Stephen. Billy was cooperative with us during our interview.
So how do you know Steve?
Steve, I've known him about 10 years now.
Okay.
We worked on vehicles together and just about every day, you know.
Detectives find the garage incident suspicious, but Billy insists he had nothing to do with Stephen's death.
Billy had told us that the reason he had went into the garage was because he was concerned that Ina was going to sell the truck. And Billy knew that Stephen was trying to fix it up as a gift for his son, Ryan.
According to Billy, the person they should be interrogating is Ina.
She's not a likable person.
When you say she's not likable, what about her is not likable?
I went over one day at their house and I was leaned over in the truck gathering my tools up, and she come out with a big old knife and tried to stab me. Her friend Lynn was with me,
Okay.
and she took the knife away from her and had her in a headlock.
How long ago was that?
2 years ago.
And for no reason? Was she just mad about anything?
Just mad. She gets mad, Steve. If she don't get her way, she's bad. I mean, really bad.
He mentioned a friend of his named Lynn had told him that Ina had talked about poisoning Billy and Stephen with antifreeze.
Lynn had said that her and Ina were joking about the boys being the boys. Something about them being frustrating or something like that.
And Ina said, hey, we could just put antifreeze in Billy and Steve's Gatorades and they would never know the difference.
With Ina and Billy both accusing each other, investigators find themselves wondering who to trust.
Anytime somebody wants to come to law enforcement and point the finger, of course, we have to kind of keep them in the back of our mind as well. Are they just trying to distract a situation to kind of take the heat off of them?
However, that statement about antifreeze in his Gatorade was pretty crucial to the investigation, because now we know it's a manner of administering the poison that ultimately killed Stephen. At this point during the interview, it was definitely starting to look like Ina might have had something to do with this.
As the investigation into Stephen Riley's murder gets underway, his son Ryan travels to North Dakota to handle preparations for his funeral. The two had recently reconnected after years of estrangement.
This is my first year after finishing boot camp for Army. Me and my father had made some arrangements to meet up and see each other after all those years, but I ended up going on a rotation out to Europe. My father was very interested into seeing how me and my brothers were off in life. He missed all of us deeply. We were all very devastated and hurt. It's like losing half of you. When I flew up there and the case finally got opened, I felt motivated to just hopefully bring whoever did it to justice.
When Ryan arrives, he finds Stephen and Ina's neighbor, Rebecca Mello, there to greet him.
She kind of looked around to make sure Ina wasn't eavesdropping, and she said that she thought it was a little suspicious that Ina, she never went to the ICU to visit him or anything.
I said to Ryan, I'm so sorry about your dad, but I can't hold it in. I have to tell someone. I personally began thinking that Ina had done something to Stephen. The week leading up to it, Stephen was not talking right, acting right, walking right. He was getting sicker and sicker, and Ina was like, he'll be fine, he'll be fine.
When Ryan meets with detectives to discuss the case on September 8th, he shares those suspicions. And according to Ryan, Ina had plenty of reason to kill his father.
He was talking about how he was getting a large sum of money. I guess it was just like family inheritance.
Okay.
And he said whenever that came through, he was gonna take that truck that he had in the garage that he was working on for me.
Yeah.
Drive that down to Texas, because he had set up like a trust fund for me and my brothers.
Stephen had told him that he was going to be inheriting a great sum of money from an uncle who lived in Ireland.
He was supposed to inherit $17 million from overseas somewhere.
I was pretty skeptical about it because it's just out of the blue. And it's from some family member that I've never heard of or seen. I was a little surprised and shocked that my father was going to be getting a huge amount, but he put all of his trust into that.
I don't know if in his mind things might have got a little bit twisted.
Steve, he did talk to me about that money. I told him not to get his hopes up. I kept feeding to him that, yo, bro, do you even know who this is? He always changed the subject.
That got everybody's suspicions raised. $17 million is a lot of money, and a very good motive to do something like this.
Ryan says his father's friend and former landlord, Wesley Torgerson, told him they went to meet with an attorney to sign the paperwork. On September 9th, investigators ask Wesley and his son Shannon to come in for an interview.
You guys can have a seat here. Thanks for coming.
Yep.
Wesley confirms that 2 days before Stephen died, he drove Stephen and Ina to the airport to meet with a British attorney. While they waited for the man to arrive, Stephen began to look ill.
And ultimately, the lawyer did not show up. During that time is when Stephen's condition really deteriorated.
When Douglas and I came down on the concrete, there was a abutment, and we got him, so he kind of went down and sat there, and then he fell over backwards.
The Torgersons say they tried to take Stephen to get help, but Ina insisted it wasn't necessary.
Ina was, nope, he just needs to go home. Just take him home.
Ina was very adamant that it was just heat stroke and that Ina would care for him back at the apartment.
Wesley says that when he went back to check on Stephen the day before he died, Ina was acting strangely.
He thought it was maybe 10 o'clock in the morning. He started to drive up the driveway, and he said Ina was standing outside with the door open.
She saw my car and recognized me, and, excuse my language, but she said, oh, and in the house she went and shut the door.
Wes asked her, well, where is he? Ina said that he went to the walk-in clinic.
So Wesley takes it upon himself to go to all the clinics. We have a small city, but all of those trips take a lot of time. And there's no sign of him ever getting any medical help at that point. He went back to the residence to confront Ina about that. And she pretty much shuts him out, shuts the door, and doesn't want to talk to him about it.
Looking back, Wesley is now convinced Stephen was inside the house dying, and Ina knew it.
She wouldn't even let me in the door. She slammed it shut.
She made sure that the victim was not going to get emergency medical help until it was too late.
Coming up, detectives take a closer look at Ina's motive.
Stephen would tell me, between you and I, when I get this money, I'm finally leaving Ina.
And quickly realize they have all been deceived.
As soon as Ina mentioned that Stephen had died, the emails began to get rejected.
It was just fake.
Less than 4 days into the investigation, Ina Kenoyer has emerged as the primary suspect in her boyfriend's murder. To learn more about their relationship, detectives interview the upstairs neighbor, Rebecca Mello.
They were truly best friends in the beginning. Ina was very quiet. She was hard to read at times because she didn't show as much emotion as Stephen. When she would tell me these stories of her childhood, I would try to comfort her and tell her that's something you should get help for as an adult. Navigate through that trauma.
According to Rebecca, Ina never sought help to overcome her psychological problems, and it eventually took a toll on Stephen.
She always told me they were husband and wife, where Steve would tell me, she's a crazy bitch, we're not married. He's like, but I met her at a homeless shelter, and if I leave her, she'll have absolutely no one.
Rebecca says Stephen had been looking for the right way to end things with Ina, and his inheritance finally made that possible.
Stephen would tell me, between you and I, when I get this money, I'm finally leaving Ina. He could leave Ina and not feel guilty because he would set her up with an apartment or something.
But it seemed that in the days leading up to Stephen's death, Ina became aware of his true intentions.
I feel Ina overheard things that Stephen had said in that garage, and it got the best of her. She was very resentful of the thought of him having that money and leaving her, and her having nothing. And she thought those things she overheard were gonna take place so she would get that money before anyone else.
Rebecca tells police that her suspicions began shortly after Stephen was taken to the hospital.
I said, Ina, is everything okay? She was like, yeah, he got sick. He was poisoned. Insisting Steve got poisoned by antifreeze.
She said this to you on Sunday.
After the ambulance left.
To investigators, the timing immediately throws up red flags.
Stephen wasn't dead yet, and nobody had talked about antifreeze or poisoning at that point. We didn't know for 2 days, so how would Ina know within hours of him being brought to the hospital, unless she is the one that did it? During that conversation, Rebecca asked her who would have done it.
She told me Billy and his friends were poisoning him all week because he was getting sicker and sicker. She said they were bringing him food and milk. I would ask, but why? She couldn't answer. She would jump to a different subject.
People often try to deflect the questions that they're being asked when they feel that they're now in the line of sight. It's kind of that fight or flight moment. But you can't just take it at face value. Every word that people say could be the next clue.
Detectives are certain they're on the right track, but they need more to link Ina to the crime.
All of the evidence that we have at this point is circumstantial.
So we made a decision to go try to talk to Ina.
We talked to her last. I wanted to wait until the end, after we talked to everyone else, because I wanted to see what she had to say.
Coming up, detectives face off with their prime suspect.
He wasn't at the walk-in clinic.
He was at the hospital.
He wasn't at the hospital. He wasn't anywhere yet.
And she reaches a breaking point.
As soon as we confronted Ina, she went ballistic.
Detectives now consider Ina Kenoyer to be the prime suspect in her boyfriend's poisoning death. Having just learned their victim was expected to receive a multi-million-dollar inheritance, police press Ina for a confession.
She seemed to be the one that was closest to him, that knew the most about the money, and that ultimately would benefit from whatever money he was going to get if he wasn't around, at least in her mind.
When they confront her about Stephen's multi-million-dollar inheritance, Ina claims she knew about it, but it didn't interest her at all.
Was he gonna make sure you got money?
No.
Okay.
Because I kept telling him I don't want it. I was like, is it cursed? And people that go after it are dying?
She offered up that all of the people that have been heir to this inheritance all mysteriously just passed away.
She also denies the Torgersons' accusation that she prevented Stephen from getting medical attention.
Steve started getting really, really sick. And I kept begging him to let me call the ambulance. And he's like, no, I'll be fine with some sleep.
There's reports that Wes came to the house that morning, and you said that Steve was at the walk-in clinic. He wasn't at the walk-in clinic.
Steve didn't want to see Wes anymore.
Okay, but Steve wasn't at the walk-in clinic.
He was at the hospital.
He wasn't at the hospital. He wasn't anywhere yet.
Ina's now saying that she had begged him to go to the hospital. Ina had also said that he went to the walk-in clinic, but Stephen had never been checked in to any of these facilities. As soon as we confronted Ina with the contradictions that she had made, she went ballistic.
I don't know what happened. I wasn't there. I wish I was there. I wish I was with him every second of the day that day. I wish I watched every single... But I'm not his mom.
There was just kind of an explosion of anger. And I think that was really the moment when the suspect realized that they had been caught. And then she just ultimately said she wanted a lawyer, and that was it.
You guys are so unbelievable.
As certain as investigators are that Ina poisoned Stephen, they didn't get the confession they were hoping for. So they're forced to let Ina go while they continue to build their case against her.
When we arrest people, we want to have all the information that we can. So we need to get all that together and present it to our state's attorney's office so they have the whole picture in front of them.
Almost 2 months after Stephen's death, we were finally able to obtain a signed arrest warrant for Ina for murder. On October 30th of 2023, I then went up to her residence. Ina came out, and she was placed under arrest.
I was been out there the whole freaking day. You are innocent until proven guilty, okay? But there is a warrant planned for your arrest. Okay?
I've never done anything. I haven't done anything. Not ever.
While the case against Ina remains largely circumstantial, one of the most important pieces of evidence is the inheritance letter that gave Ina her motive. But when investigators obtain a copy of the paperwork, they make a shocking discovery.
So the letter was just a generic letter. It was on this regular printed letterhead, but it had come through email. It wasn't signed by anyone in particular. It just said, "Thank you, Arab Bank of Switzerland." Stephen Riley was in a different font than the rest of the letter, and some of the capitalization in the letters was off. There was some correspondence with a person who called himself Richard, and in those emails was conversations about Stephen needing to send his personal information to this particular person so they could verify who he was. As soon as Ina mentioned that Stephen had died, the emails began to get rejected. The email was no longer a valid email.
It was all a scam.
It was just fake. None of it was real.
This person was only trying to get information and or money from Stephen. For what purpose, we don't know. A gentleman from the Department of Treasury assisted us in trying to see if it was related to any other scams that they were aware of. It really kind of just landed us at a dead end, so there's nothing to follow up on.
And everybody that hears that story is like, oh, that's a scam, that's a scam. But to Steve and Ina, it was 100% true.
I was very hopeful that we had brought enough to the table so that we could get a conviction, but I was very nervous. We wanted to make sure that we don't overlook something that we may have missed that could be detrimental to this case. Ultimately, we want to make sure that justice is served.
After a 2-month-long investigation, Ina Kenoyer is set to stand trial for the murder of her boyfriend, Stephen Riley. Prosecutors are prepared to argue that she did it to keep his $17 million inheritance for herself. An inheritance they now know was nothing but a lie.
I believe she was aware that if she secretly administered some antifreeze in his sweet tea, that he would be gone and she would be the one who would collect the money ultimately at the end.
When she found out that her love of her life possibly planned on leaving her, I think she snapped.
Ina thought she was going to inherit that money from Stephen being his common law wife, and absolutely there was not one dime to be given to her or to Stephen.
This all could have been prevented. It didn't have to happen, and Stephen unfortunately died over literally nothing.
Despite a lack of direct evidence, the prosecution feels their case will be persuasive to the jury. But before the court date arrives, Ina and her lawyer make a surprising announcement.
In May of 2024, Ina and her attorney filed a motion for a change of plea. Ina was going to plead guilty to the charge of homicide, a double-A felony here in the state of North Dakota.
5 months later, Ina is sentenced at the Ward County Courthouse.
A lot of the times when you look at the person who's on trial for a murder, you can see something. They're looking down, they're feeling some type of way. But with Ina, it's a straightforward stare. There's nothing behind those eyes.
The judge gave Ina a 25-year sentence with 10 years of probation.
We weren't happy to hear that it was 25 with probation.
25 years is not enough. Lucky for her, the Department of Corrections doesn't serve antifreeze in their iced tea.
It's just hard for me to even comprehend that anybody would take a life over money, and then to even find out that there was really nothing that anyone was going to gain from that at all anyway. It's disturbing, really.
Stephen was just the best friend to ever have. He'd do anything for anybody. And it's just so bad that Ina had to do this to him.
I believe my dad's legacy was wanting to be a type of man to always be there to make everyone happy and just kind of live in the moment. I think I'm done grieving finally. I'm able to accept new beginnings and carry on with my dad's legacy.
New York doesn't sleep. It watches. It listens. And sometimes it remembers things it should have forgotten.
3:12 a.m.
February air cuts like glass through the Lower East Side. A narrow alley behind a shuttered textile warehouse sits in silence, soaked in sodium streetlight, empty except for trash bags split open by rats and wind. Then a patrol car rolls past, slows, stops. The officer doesn't see her at first. No movement, no sound, just a shape where no shape should be. Then the beam of a flashlight drags across the concrete and lands. A body. Female, mid-20s, lying on her side like she collapsed mid-step. No visible wounds from a distance. No blood pooling. No sign of struggle. Just stillness too perfect, too composed, like someone placed her there instead of leaving her. The officer radios it in. His voice stays level, but later he will say something felt wrong the second he saw her. Not fear, not shock, recognition, as if the scene itself knew more than it was willing to show. Within minutes, the alley fills with blue lights. Detectives, crime scene techs, yellow tape cutting the darkness into clean, artificial lines. Cameras click. Flashbulbs burn white against brick walls stained with decades of neglect. They kneel beside her. No ID.
No purse. No jewelry.
Coat intact. Clothes clean. Too clean. Her face is turned slightly upward. Eyes open. Not wide. Not terrified. Just fixed. As if she saw something she understood in the final seconds. And accepted it. The coroner notes it quietly.
No defensive wounds.
No bruising on the arms. No signs of a fight. Cause of death unclear at the scene. But something else stands out. Her fingertips.
Smooth. But
not cut, not damaged. Just absent. Fingerprints removed with precision. Not amateur work. Not panic. Methodical. Controlled. Someone took time with this. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The first whispers start right there, in the cold air over her body. This wasn't random. This wasn't rage. This was procedure. They bag everything, every thread, every particle, every possibility. The alley is combed inch by inch. Trash overturned, drains checked, walls scraped. Nothing.
No weapon.
No footprints worth tracing. No discarded items.
No drag marks.
No sign she was killed there. Which means she was brought here. Which means whoever did this chose the spot. Which means this was planned. The city hums just a few blocks away. Bars closing, music fading, taxis weaving through wet streets. Life continuing, unaware that something precise, something deliberate, just unfolded in a forgotten strip of concrete. By sunrise, the body is gone. The alley returns to what it was. Empty. Meaningless. Except it isn't. Because the case begins to spread. First internally, then quietly outward. Missing persons databases light up. No matches. Dental records run. Nothing. Facial reconstruction artists brought in. Sketches circulated. No one calls. It's like she never existed. And that's when the unease sets in. Because in a city like New York, everyone exists somewhere. Someone should be looking for her. Someone should be asking questions. But no one is. Day 3. A bartender comes forward. Says he saw her the night before. Describes her coat, her hair, her eyes. He's sure. She wasn't alone. Says there was a man with her. Sat across from her. Didn't drink. Didn't smile. Just watched. The bartender says the man barely moved. Barely blinked. Like he was waiting. They pull a sketch. Generic. Forgettable. The kind of face that dissolves in memory the second you look away. Day 5. A cab driver calls it in. Says he picked up a woman matching her description near Midtown. Dropped her closer to the docks. Says she kept checking the rear window. Not nervous. Not scared. Expecting something. He asks if someone was following her. She doesn't answer. Just says, he's already here. The line goes quiet when the detective asks her to repeat it. Because the driver swears that's exactly what she said. He's already here. Then there's the call. No traceable number. Routed through static and distance. A man's voice.
Calm.
Controlled. She wasn't supposed to be there.
No emotion. No hesitation. Click. Gone.
The detectives replay it. Over and over. Looking for background noise. Traffic. Voices. Anything. Nothing. Just silence. The kind of silence that feels intentional. By week 2, the case is shifting. Not expanding. Collapsing. Every lead circles back into nothing. Every path folds in on itself. The bartender can't remember more. The cab driver refuses further interviews. Says he said enough. And the sketch. No matches. The city shrugs. Another victim. Another mystery. Another file waiting to be buried under the weight of 1,000 others. But one detail refuses to disappear. A single fiber.
Red.
Synthetic. Microscopic. Found along the inner seam of her coat. Out of place. Unexplained.
Logged. Tagged. Stored.
1987 doesn't have the tools to read it. Not really. Not the way it needs to be read.
So it sits.
And waits. Weeks turn into months. The warehouse behind the alley closes for good. Windows boarded. Doors chained. Whatever secrets it held locked behind rust and neglect. The patrol officer transfers precincts. The lead detective takes another case. The file thickens, then stagnates. And slowly, almost gently, the case dies. Not with a conclusion. With silence. By 1992, it's official. Cold case. Stamped.
Filed.
Forgotten. But something doesn't sit right. Because patterns don't vanish. They hide. A sanitation worker reports something strange months later. Says he saw a car parked near that same alley 3 nights in a row before the body was found. Same position. Same headlights. Engine running. No one inside, at least no one he could see.
He thought nothing of it at the time.
Now, he's not so sure. They check traffic cams. Nothing usable. They check parking violations. No record. The car doesn't exist. Or it was never meant to. The deeper they dig, the more the case feels constructed. Not chaotic. Not emotional. Engineered. And that's what lingers. Not the victim. Not the alley. The precision. Because someone removed her identity. Someone controlled the scene. Someone left exactly one thing behind. Not a fingerprint. Not a weapon. A fiber. And that feels less like a mistake and more like a variable. Something that shouldn't have been there. Something that almost wasn't noticed. Years pass. The city changes. Buildings rise. Streets shift. People forget. But evidence doesn't forget. It waits. Locked in boxes. Sealed in plastic. Sitting in rooms no one visits unless they have a reason. And for decades no one does. Until one day someone opens that box again. Not because of her. Because of something else. Another case. Another body. Another detail that doesn't fit. And suddenly the red fiber isn't alone anymore. It has a match. And when two impossible things become connected, they stop being impossible. They become a pattern. And patterns don't stay buried forever. Because the truth about that night in 1987 was never lost. It was delayed. And when it finally surfaces, it won't just ask who she was. It will ask how many others were erased just as cleanly. How many times this was done without error. How long someone has been doing this without being seen. And, the most dangerous question of all, was she the first mistake? Or just the one that got noticed? Because somewhere in the city someone walked away from that alley without looking back.
Calm, clean, certain.
Certain they had done this perfectly. Certain no one would ever connect it. Certain the story ended there. They were wrong.
They just didn't know it yet.
The box hadn't been opened in years. Dust settled thick along its edges, undisturbed, like time itself had decided to leave it alone. Evidence Room 4B. Shelf C, Case File. Unidentified female, Lower East Side, 1987. Cold. Forgotten. Filed away with hundreds of others that never found their ending. Until the day it did. It wasn't her name that brought it back. She still didn't have one. It was something else. A lab request tied to a completely different case. A body recovered upstate.
Different year.
Different circumstances. Same absence of identity. Same surgical removal of fingerprints. Same quiet precision. And buried in the reported detail, so small it almost didn't register. Synthetic fiber.
Red.
That was all it took. The technician handling the sample didn't know the history, didn't know the alley, didn't know about the anonymous call or the bartender or the cab driver who heard something he never forgot. All they saw was a match that shouldn't exist. So they pulled the old file. Opened the box. And just like that, 1987 wasn't over anymore. The fiber was re-examined under modern analysis. What once looked generic, mass-produced, untraceable, began to shift under new light.
Chemical composition.
Polymer structure. Manufacturing anomalies. It wasn't just synthetic. It was specific. Produced in limited batches. Industrial grade. Used not in clothing, but in specialized upholstery. Automotive interiors. certain high-end vehicle lines from the late 1980s. Suddenly, the alley got smaller. The possibilities narrowed. Whoever transported her used a car that left something behind. Something microscopic. Something that waited 30 years to be understood. Detectives were reassigned. Not the same ones. Not the same generation. But the file landed on desks that didn't remember how it failed the first time. And that changed everything. Because fresh eyes don't see dead ends. They see openings. The two cases were laid side by side. Photos, reports, autopsy notes,
Timelines.
different victims. Same method. No identity.
No struggle.
No witnesses who saw anything useful. And now the same fiber. But the second body had something the first didn't. Time had changed the world. Cameras. Records. Digital trails that didn't exist in 1987. They traced her last known movements. Gas station footage. A blurred figure stepping into a car, just outside the frame. License plate unreadable. But the interior. Red stitching along the seat seam. Barely visible. But enough. The lab confirmed it. Same material. Same source. Suddenly, the case wasn't cold. It was breathing again. They went back to the original scene. Not the alley. It was gone, replaced by a new structure that didn't remember what came before, but the surrounding grid. Streets. Patterns. Movement. They reconstructed what they could. Where she might have come from. Where she might have been taken. How long she was in that vehicle before ending up on cold concrete under a flickering streetlight. And then they noticed something else. A gap. A missing window in time that didn't align. The cab driver said he dropped her near the docks. But the distance between that drop-off and the alley didn't match the estimated time of death. Not unless she was somewhere else first. Held. Not long. But long enough. That shifted the entire structure of the case. This wasn't a quick act. It was controlled. Sequenced. Like steps being followed in order.
Find.
Isolate. Remove.
Clean.
Place. And that word, place, kept coming back. Because the alley wasn't random. It was chosen. But why that alley? Why that location? They dug into the history of the warehouse that used to stand there. Ownership records. Tenants. Shipping logs. Employees. Most of it was gone. Lost in time, paperwork dissolved into archives, no one digitized. But one name surfaced. Not a suspect. Not yet. Just a connection. A logistics manager who worked the docks during that period. Known for being meticulous, quiet, reliable, the kind of man who didn't stand out. The kind of man no one remembers noticing. He left the job in late 1987. No reason listed. No forwarding address. Just gone. At the time, it meant nothing. Now, it meant everything. They pulled what they could. Old payroll records, tax filings, anything that hinted at where he went. The trail was thin. But not gone. Because unlike 1987, the world had learned to keep ghosts on record. Meanwhile, the second case deepened. Autopsy revealed the same absence of struggle, same calm expression, same lack of trauma that would suggest panic or resistance. Which meant one thing:
control.
Chemical or psychological, something that removed fear from the equation. Something that made victims compliant. Willing even. That was the part that unsettled everyone. Because it suggested interaction. Conversation. Time spent together before the end. Not a blitz attack. Not chaos. Something slower. Intentional. The kind of thing you don't rush. The kind of thing you've done before. The lab pushed further. The fiber wasn't just matched between the two cases. It showed where patterns. Degradation consistent with long-term use. Meaning the same source, possibly the same vehicle, could have been active across years. Maybe decades. That's when the room went quiet. Because if that was true, then two bodies weren't a coincidence. They were fragments. And fragments imply a whole. They ran missing persons again, not just locally, nationally, cross-referenced with unidentified remains. Patterns started to flicker. Cases dismissed as unrelated. Victims found in different states. Same lack of identity. Same absence of fingerprints. Same eerie stillness in death. Most never connected. Until now. And suddenly the scope widened beyond anything the original detectives could have imagined. This wasn't a single event.
It was a system.
One that moved, adapted,
evolved.
One that didn't leave noise. Didn't leave mistakes. Except once. That red fiber. The thing that didn't belong. The thing that slipped through. The thing that waited 30 years to be seen. They circled back to the anonymous call. Pulled the recording from degraded archives. Enhanced it. Filtered it. And beneath the voice, something surfaced. A sound.
Faint.
Rhythmic. Not traffic. Not static. A signal.
Maritime.
A foghorn in the distance. Which meant the caller wasn't far from water. Which meant when he said, she wasn't supposed to be there, he might have been closer to the truth than anyone realized. Because maybe she wasn't. Maybe the alley was never the intended location. Maybe something went wrong. Something forced a change. A deviation. And that deviation left evidence behind. Evidence that connected everything. Which meant the entire system, whatever it was, depended on precision. On routine. On never breaking pattern. And once that pattern broke, it became visible. The question now wasn't just who did it. It was how many times they didn't make that mistake. How many victims were placed exactly where they were supposed to be. Never found. Never linked. Never questioned. Because nothing was out of place. But 1987. Something was. And that's why it survived. Not because it was solved. Because it was imperfect. Because whoever did this wasn't as flawless as they believed. And now, decades later, someone was following the fracture line left behind. Tracing it back. Step by step. Toward a person who had lived quietly. Worked quietly. Disappeared quietly. And might have never expected that one microscopic thread would be enough to unravel everything. They didn't say his name out loud at first. Not because they didn't have one. Because once spoken it would stop being a theory and become a direction. The logistics manager. That was all he had been in the file. A title buried in shipping records tied to a warehouse that no longer existed, connected to a stretch of dockside operations that had long since been replaced by glass, steel, and sanitized memory. But titles don't vanish. They evolve. And people leave traces even when they try not to. The first real break didn't come from the past. It came from the present. A database match. Partial. Incomplete. But enough to suggest movement. The name, when it finally surfaced, felt ordinary. The kind of name that blends into a crowd, passes through systems without resistance, signs documents without raising a second glance. He had relocated twice after 1987. First to New Jersey, then further north. No criminal record.
No outstanding warrants.
No flagged behavior. On paper, he was invisible, which was exactly the problem. Because invisible men don't leave patterns across decades. Unless they know how not to be seen. They pulled everything. Employment records, lease agreements, utility bills, old drivers' licenses scanned into systems that didn't exist when the first body was found. The timeline began to take shape. He left the docks weeks after the 1987 case.
No farewell. No explanation.
Just absence. Picked up work elsewhere within months.
Different industry.
Same role. Logistics. Movement. Coordination.
Control.
The pattern wasn't in what he did. It was in how consistently he stayed near systems that allowed things to be moved without being questioned. Shipments.
Vehicles. Routes. Gaps.
Places where something or someone could exist briefly and disappear. They mapped his locations against unidentified cases. At first, it looked like coincidence. Then the alignment tightened. A Jane Doe in Pennsylvania, 1991. No ID.
No prints.
Found near a transit corridor he would have had access to. A body in upstate New York, 1994. Same absence. Same stillness. Recovered less than 10 miles from a facility he managed temporarily. Each case alone nothing. Together something forming.
A shadow.
A path that only becomes visible when you stop looking at single points and start tracing movement. But patterns can deceive. They needed more. They needed something that placed him not near the victims, but with them. The vehicle became the focus. That red fiber had already narrowed the field to a specific range of automotive interiors used in high-end models from the late 80s. Records that old were incomplete, fragmented, but not gone. Insurance databases, registration logs, archived dealership records. They started rebuilding a list. Owners of vehicles matching the interior profile, cross-referenced by geography, filtered by proximity to known case locations. The list shrank.
Slowly.
Relentlessly. Until it reached a number small enough to matter. And his name was on it. Registered in 1986. Sold 2 years later. Transaction incomplete. No clear buyer listed. A vehicle that entered the system and then slipped out of it. But not before leaving a microscopic trace that would survive long enough to be noticed. They didn't move on him yet. Not with this. Not with something that could still be coincidence. Because coincidence has a way of collapsing under pressure. They needed to build weight. They revisited the second case. The upstate body. This time, they looked beyond the victim. They looked at the environment. Surrounding businesses.
Camera angles.
Traffic patterns. And then they found it. Footage that had been logged, stored, ignored. A gas station camera from a night that didn't seem important at the time. A car pulling in just outside the frame. The angle was wrong, the lighting poor. But when they enhanced it, slowed it down. Something emerged. A silhouette stepping out.
Male.
Average build. No defining features. But the way he moved. Measured. Deliberate.
No guastimotion.
He walks around the vehicle. Opens the passenger side. Leans in. Not rushed. Not violent. Controlled. Like he's speaking to someone. Or checking something. Then he closes the door. Gets back in. Drives away. Minutes later, the victim is last seen alive. They overlaid the timing. It fit. Not perfectly. but close enough to tighten the line. Still, it wasn't enough. Because controlled movement doesn't prove identity. It suggests familiarity, routine, behavior that repeats. And that's when behavioral analysis entered the case. Not to profile who he was, but how he operated. Victims showed no signs of struggle, which meant compliance, which meant approach. He didn't force. He convinced. Or he used something that removed resistance entirely. Toxicology reports from older cases were limited. But the newer one showed traces. Not a common sedative. Not something easily accessible. A compound that would induce calm, reduce fear, slow reaction, without rendering the victim unconscious, awake, aware, but unable to act. That changed everything. Because it meant time. Time spent together. Time for conversation. Time for him to observe them before the end. And that suggested something else. Selection. He didn't choose randomly. He chose deliberately. Which meant he watched. Waited. Learned routines. Identified moments of isolation. Moments where someone could step away from the world and not be immediately missed. That's why they weren't reported. Or not quickly. That's why identification failed. Because he didn't take people at the center of someone's life. He took those at the edges. And erased what little connection remained. The more they understood the method, the more the past started to rearrange itself. The bartender's memory. The silent man who didn't drink. The cab driver's passenger who said, "He's already here." Those weren't fragments anymore. They were glimpses. Moments where the system intersected with the visible world. Moments where he was seen, but not recognized. And then there was the call. She wasn't supposed to be there. That line shifted now. It wasn't just a statement. It was a fracture. An admission wrapped in control. Because if she wasn't supposed to be there, then something interrupted the process. Something forced him to deviate. And deviation leaves traces. Traces like fibers. Traces like placement errors. Traces that don't align with the pattern. Which meant 1987 wasn't just a case. It was the exception. The one time something went wrong. The one time he had to improvise. And in improvisation, perfection breaks. They dug deeper into his timeline. Not just where he lived, but when he moved. The gaps between jobs. The unexplained relocations. Each shift followed a cluster of unidentified cases. Not immediately, but within range. Like echoes. And then something even more unsettling emerged. There were periods where nothing happened. Years with no matching cases. No unidentified victims fitting the pattern. Silence. Until activity resumed again in a different region. Which meant one of two things.
He stopped.
Or he moved somewhere the system couldn't see. Either possibility carried weight. Because stopping suggested control.
Choice.
Moving suggested expansion. Adaptation. Both pointed to someone who understood risk. Understood timing. Understood how to disappear, not just physically, but statistically. And that's when the investigation stopped being about solving a case. And started becoming about proving something that had never officially existed. A sequence. A system. A person who had operated for years without detection. Because every piece, on its own, looked like nothing.
Until you connected them.
And once connected, they didn't look like coincidence anymore. They looked like design. The kind of design that doesn't happen by accident. The kind that's built over time. Refined. Tested. Perfected. Except once. 1987. The alley. The fiber. The placement that didn't belong. The mistake. And now, decades later, they were standing at the edge of it, looking directly at the possibility that one man, quiet, unremarkable, forgotten by every system he passed through, had been moving through the country for years, leaving behind nothing but silence, until the silence started to speak. And when it did, it pointed back to him. Not with certainty. Not yet. But with something stronger. Consistency. And consistency is where truth begins to take shape. Because patterns don't lie. People do. And somewhere in that pattern, he was still there. Waiting to be seen. They didn't rush him. Not yet. Because rushing meant noise. And noise was the one thing this case had never survived. So they watched. Quietly.
Carefully.
The way you observe something that has already proven it knows how to disappear. His current address sat in a part of the state that didn't draw attention. Suburban. Predictable. The kind of place where routines blend together. Where neighbors recognize faces but never ask questions. A house that looked like every other house. Neutral paint. Trimmed lawn. Curtains always drawn just enough to block the interior without appearing closed. He had been there for years.
No disturbances. No complaints.
No police calls.
Utility usage consiste. No speakers. No gaps.
A man who lived correctly. That was the first thing that unsettled them. Because people who follow patterns that precisely are usually hiding something inside them. Surveillance began at a distance.
Marca vehicles.
Rotating shifts. No direct approach. They logged everything. When he left, when he returned, how long he stayed out, what he carried, what he didn't.
He worked part-time now.
A warehouse distribution center. Nothing high-level. Nothing that matched the precision they were starting to see in the case. But it gave him access.
Vehicles. Routes.
Movement. That hadn't changed. What had changed was him. Age softened the outline, but not the behavior. He moved the same way the man in the gas station footage had moved. Measured. Efficient.
No guastimotion.
He didn't look around unnecessarily. Didn't linger.
Didn't rush.
Everything had purpose. Even the smallest actions. Opening a car door. Closing it. Standing still. Watching. Days passed. Then weeks. And the longer they watched, the more something else began to emerge.
Absence.
Not of activity. Of connection. No visitors.
No social patterns.
No one entering that house except him. No one leaving except him. No family. No friends. No trace of a life that extended beyond function. It was as if he had built a world that required no one else. And that matched the pattern. Because the victims had also existed at the edges. People without strong ties. People who could vanish without immediate consequence. The question shifted. Not just how he operated, but why he chose that type. Because selection tells you more than action. And action, in this case, had already told them enough to be afraid. They moved closer. Not physically. Digitally. Old records were reprocessed. Employment applications. Background checks from decades past. At the time, they were shallow. Now they weren't. Fragments began to align. an address he listed in the early 80s. A location tied to another unidentified case that had never been connected. A temporary contract job in a region where 2 disappearances overlapped within months. At the time, coincidence. Now, a sequence tightening. They built a map. Not of crimes. Of him. And overlaid the known cases. It didn't form a straight line. It formed clusters. Periods of activity followed by silence. Then movement. Then activity again. Like breathing. Inhale, exhale.
Take. Pause.
Take again. And, in every cluster, the same details resurfaced. No identity.
No prints. No struggle.
That was the signature. Not something he left behind. Something he removed. Which made it harder to prove. Because proving absence is harder than proving presence. But not impossible. They needed something current. Something that tied the past to now. Because everything's so far pointed. Nothing confirmed. And confirmation required risk. So they took it. A soft approach. Not an arrest. Not even a confrontation. Just a conversation. A knock on the door. Casual. Routine. 2 detectives. Plain clothes.
No visible tensión.
He opened the door on the second knock.
No hesitation. No surprise.
Just awareness. The kind of awareness that registers everything in a fraction of a second and chooses what to show. They introduced themselves. Gave a reason that wasn't the real one. Follow-up questions related to his old employment near the docks. Standard procedure. Nothing accusatory. Nothing direct. He listened. Nodded. Answered. His voice was even. Measured. No visible stress. No flicker of irritation. But something was there. Not in what he said. In what he didn't. His eyes never moved past them. Never scanned the street. Never checked surroundings. Because he already had. Before opening the door. That realization came too late. Because by the time they noticed it, he had already measured them. Filed them. Decided something. The conversation lasted 6 minutes. 6 minutes of controlled normalcy. Then it ended. They walked away.
No escalation. No mistake.
Just information. But something had changed. Not in the case. In him. Because the next day, his routine shifted. Subtle. Almost invisible. But there. He left earlier. Returned later. Took different routes. Paused at intersections longer than necessary. Not enough to draw attention. Enough to confirm awareness. He knew. Not everything. But enough. And that meant the clock had started. Because men like him don't wait to be caught. They adjust. They disappear. Or they act.
Surveillance tightened.
Every movement logged. Every deviation tracked. And then, 3 nights later, he didn't go home. His car was seen leaving the distribution center. Normal time. Normal exit. But instead of heading toward his house, he turned.
Away.
Toward an industrial stretch that hadn't changed much since the late 80s. Older buildings. Less traffic. Less visibility. The kind of place that still had shadows deep enough to hide something. Or someone. They followed at a distance. Careful.
No lights. No mistakes.
He drove without hesitation.
No sudden turns.
No attempts to shake a tail. Just certainty. Like he had done this before. Many times. He pulled into a lot behind a closed facility. Engine off. Lights out. He sat there. Minutes passed. Then longer. No movement. The team waited. Watching. Recording. And then another car appeared. Slow. Cautious. Headlights cutting through the dark. It pulled in not beside him, but across. Distance maintained. Doors didn't open. Engines idled. Two vehicles. Facing each other. Separated by empty space. Time stretched. And in that silence, something old returned. That same feeling from 1987.
Wrong.
Not chaotic. Not violent. Controlled. Deliberate. Like 2 points in a pattern aligning exactly where they were meant to. Then his door opened. He stepped out. Same movement. Same precision. Walked forward. Not fast. Not slow. Stopped halfway. The other car's door opened. A figure stepped out. Smaller. Lighter. Uncertain. They said something. Audio couldn't reach. But body language could. And what it showed was not force. Not fear. It was compliance. Voluntary. And that was the moment everything locked into place. Because this wasn't a hunt. It was an approach. And whatever he said, whatever method he used, it worked. Every time. The team moved. Not rushed. But no longer waiting. Because this wasn't history anymore. This was now. And if they were right, then 30 years of silence was about to end. Right there. In a place that looked like nothing. Just like the alley in 1987. Just like every location that came after. Ordinary. Forgettable. Until you understood what happened there. And by the time most people would notice, it would already be over. Just like before. Except this time. Someone was watching. And this time, he wasn't alone in the dark. They moved before the moment could close. Not rushed, not reckless, but with the kind of precision that only comes when hesitation is no longer an option. 2 units from opposite ends of the lot. Engines cut. Doors opened in silence. Footsteps measured against gravel that threatened to betray every movement. The distance between the 2 figures, him and the other, shrank slowly. Not by force, by agreement. That was the part that refused to make sense.
No struggle. No visible coerción.
The second figure, female, early 20s, approximate, stood with a posture that wasn't defensive. Shoulders relaxed, arms at her sides, head tilted just slightly, like she was listening. Listening or following. The man stopped a few feet away from her. Said something. Still no audio. But her response was immediate. A step forward. Voluntary. That single movement hit harder than anything else. Because it confirmed what the files had been trying to say for decades. He didn't take. He led. The officers closed in. Faster now. No more waiting. Lights snapped on, sharp, blinding, surgical. Commands cut through the dark. Police, don't move. The moment shattered. The woman froze. Eyes wide now. Confusion replacing whatever calm had held her seconds before. But him. He didn't flinch. Didn't run. Didn't even turn immediately. He stood there as if the interruption had always been part of the sequence. Then slowly he looked up, directly toward the approaching lights. And for the first time, there was something in his expression. Not panic. Recognition. As if he had been expecting this, just not tonight. Hands raised. No resistance.
No denial.
Just compliance. And in that silence, something heavier than fear settled across the scene. Because men who get caught like this usually break. He didn't. They separated them immediately. The woman was pulled back, wrapped in a blanket, checked for injuries.
None. No marks. No bruising.
No signs of force. Her pulse elevated, breathing shallow, but physically untouched. She kept asking the same question. What happened? Over and over. Like she didn't understand how she got there. Like the last few minutes had slipped out of her memory entirely. That alone changed the case. Because it meant the control wasn't just physical. It was psychological. Or chemical. Or both. Meanwhile, he was placed in cuffs.
No struggle.
No resistance. Just that same measured stillness. Like the process had simply shifted, not ended. They searched the vehicle first. Because the vehicle had always been the constant. Always been the link. And inside. They found it. Not weapons. Not restraints. Nothing obvious. Just order. The interior was immaculate. Too immaculate. Every surface clean, every seam intact. Except the stitching.
Red.
Faint under the dim light. But unmistakable. The same material. The same fiber. Still there after all these years. Waiting. They moved to the trunk. Opened it slowly.
Carefully.
And for a second no one spoke. Because it wasn't empty. And it wasn't what they expected. No body. No tools. Just a container. Industrial grade.
Sealed.
Temperature controlled.
Inside.
Vials.
Dozens of them.
Labeled. Not with names. With dates. Each one precise. Measured. Organized. Like samples. The lab would confirm it later. But in that moment they already knew. Chemical compounds.
Custom.
Refined over time. Not mass-produced. Not purchased. Developed. Adjusted. Perfected. That was how he did it. Not force. Not speed.
Control.
He didn't overpower his victims. He removed the need to. He created compliance. Engineered it. And then guided it. Step by step. Until they walked into their own disappearance. The realization spread through the team like cold air. Because this wasn't just a killer. This was a process.
One that evolved.
One that improved. One that required patience. And time. Lots of time. They secured the scene.
Called it in.
Forensics moved fast. Everything documented. Everything preserved. Because every detail mattered now. Every fragment could tie back to decades of silence. He was transported without incident.
No statements.
No resistance. Just that same quiet awareness. Like he was already calculating what came next. At the station, they processed him. Fingerprints taken.
Run.
And for the first time, The system responded. Not with a hit, with a gap. Partial records. Fragments from old employment databases. Nothing criminal. Nothing definitive. But enough to confirm identity. Enough to stop him from being invisible. And once he had a name in the system, everything started to shift. Because now they could connect. Past addresses. Past movements. Past proximity to cases that had never been solved. The interrogation room was prepared.
Simple.
Controlled.
No distractions.
He sat down without being told. Hands resting calmly on the table. Eyes steady. Watching. Not the room. The people. Detectives entered. Same two who knocked on his door days earlier.
No uniforms.
No raised voices. Just presence. They started slow. Basic questions.
Name. Background.
Employment. He answered everything.
Calm. Precise.
Nothing extra. Nothing missing. Until they shifted. Until the questions moved toward 1987. That was the first pause. Not long. Just enough to register. Lower East Side. Warehouse. Unidentified female. The alley. The fiber. Silence. Then, a slight change. Not in posture. In breathing. Barely visible. But there. He knew. Of course he knew. Because that was the one. The deviation. The mistake. They didn't accuse. They didn't push. They placed the evidence. One piece at a time. The fiber. The vehicle. The pattern. The second case. The footage. The vials. Each detail tightening the space around him. Not closing it. Shaping it. And through it all, he listened.
No interruption. No denial.
Just attention. Like he was reviewing something familiar. Something he had already accepted long ago. And then, finally, they said it. She wasn't supposed to be there, was she? The room went still. Because that line, that exact line, had lived in this case for 30 years. And now it was here. In front of him. Waiting.
For the first time.
He reacted. Not outwardly. But something shifted behind his eyes. A recognition deeper than anything before. And when he spoke, his voice matched the one from the call.
Calm.
Controlled. Unchanged by time. Yes. One word. But it cracked everything open. Because confirmation doesn't just answer a question. It creates 1,000 more. He didn't elaborate. Didn't explain. Just sat there. As if the rest would come when it needed to. Because for him, this wasn't an ending. It was just another step. In a sequence he had been following for decades.
And now,
they were finally inside it. The problem was, they still didn't know how far it went. Or how many times it had already happened. Because if 1987 was the mistake, then everything before it, and everything after, might have been perfect. And perfect crimes don't leave evidence. They leave absence. And absence is the hardest thing to prove.
But now,
they had him.
Alive.
Aware. And sitting across from them. Which meant the silence that had protected him for 30 years.
was about to be tested.
And for the first time, it might not hold. Silence has weight. In the interrogation room, it presses down on everything, walls, table, breath, thought, until even the smallest sound feels amplified. A shift in posture. A blink held half a second too long. The faint hum of fluorescent lights above that never quite settles. He sits in the center of it.
Still.
Unmoved by the pressure that breaks most people within minutes. Hands folded, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady, not defiant, not evasive. Present. Waiting. Because he understands something most don't. Silence isn't empty. It's a tool. And he has been using it for decades. The detectives don't rush to fill it. They've seen enough to know that pushing too early collapses structure. And right now, structure is everything. So they let it sit. Let the air tighten. Let the seconds stretch into something uncomfortable. Until finally, you called it a mistake.
No accusation.
No raised tone. Just a statement laid flat on the table. His gaze shifts slightly. Not away, not toward. Just adjusting. Like recalibrating. That night, the detective continues. 1987, the alley. A pause. Measured. Deliberate. Yes. Again, just one word. But it carries more this time. Not confirmation. Acknowledgement. As if they've aligned on something fundamental. And once alignment happens, movement follows. You don't make mistakes often, the second detective says. Not a question. A statement designed to provoke correction. Or agreement. Or something in between. He considers it. Not defensively. Analytically. No, he says. It lands colder than expected. Because there's no arrogance in it.
No pride.
Just fact. Like describing a process that has been refined to the point where error becomes unlikely. Not impossible, but rare. The room shifts again. Because now they're not trying to prove he did it. They're trying to understand how. How long, the first detective asks. He doesn't answer immediately. Not because he's resisting. Because he's calculating. Not what to say. What matters. Long enough, he replies. It's not evasive. It's precise. Because long enough implies duration without limit. Implies repetition. Implies experience. And experience implies numbers. They don't ask for numbers yet. Not directly. Because numbers can be denied. Process can't. You developed it, the second detective says, nodding slightly toward the file, toward the evidence waiting just outside the room. The compounds, the method. Another pause. This one shorter. Yes.
No hesitation.
No attempt to minimize. And that's when it becomes clear. He's not here to deny. He's here to control what is understood. Because understanding is power. Even now. What does it do? The first detective asks. Not what did you use? Not how did you do it? What does it do? Focus on function. On outcome. He leans back slightly. Not retreating.
Settling.
It removes urgency, he says. The phrasing is careful. Almost clinical. Fear is urgent, he continues. Panic is urgent. They create noise, resistance, mistakes. A brief pause. I remove that. The words hang. Because they don't sound like violence. They sound like design. And then, the second detective asks. He looks at her. Directly. For the first time, there's something resembling engagement. Then they listen. It's quiet, but it cuts deeper than anything else. Because listening implies trust, implies influence, implies something beyond force. You talk to them, the first detective says. Yes. What do you say? Another pause. Longer this time. Not resistance. Selection. Enough, he answers. The detectives exchange a glance. Because enough doesn't answer the question. It reframes it. Enough to what? Enough to follow. Enough to comply. Enough to step out of their lives and into his. That's when the scale starts to press in. Because this isn't about overpowering victims. It's about guiding them. And guidance leaves fewer marks. Fewer signs. Fewer mistakes. You chose them, the second detective says. People who wouldn't be missed immediately. He doesn't respond right away. But his silence confirms more than denial would. You watched them, she continues. Learn their routines. Waited for the moment. A slight shift in his posture. Not discomfort. Recognition. Yes. One word again. But it carries weight. Because now the structure is visible. Observation. Selection. Approach.
Control.
Removal. Placement. A sequence. Refined. Repeated. Perfected. Except once. 1987. She wasn't supposed to be there, the first detective says again, bringing it back. Where was she supposed to be? That question lands differently. Because it doesn't challenge the act. It challenges the deviation. And deviation is where truth leaks out. He exhales slowly. The first visible sign of something deeper. Not stress. Memory. Transit, he says. The word is simple. But it opens everything. Transit where? The second detective presses. He doesn't answer directly. Not yet. Temporary, he adds. Always temporary. The detectives lean in slightly. Because now they're close. Close to something that defines the entire operation. You held them, the first detective says. He considers the word. Held. Then shakes his head. Not held, he corrects. Contained. It's subtle. But the difference matters. Held implies force. Contained implies structure. Environment. Control without resistance. Where, she asks. Another pause.
Long.
Careful. Because this is where the boundary sits. What he gives versus what he keeps. Places that don't register, he says finally. Places designed for movement, not presence. Warehouses. Transit hubs.
Vehicles.
Spaces where something can exist briefly without being recorded as existing at all. The realization settles heavy. Because it means the crimes weren't tied to fixed locations. They were tied to systems. And systems are harder to trace. Harder to prove. How many? The first detective asks. There it is. The question they've been circling.
Direct.
Unavoidable. He looks at the table. Not avoiding. Calculating. Then back up. Enough, he says again. Same word. Different weight. Because now it replaces a number. And numbers are what make things real. What make things undeniable. Give us a number, the second detective pushes. No, he replies. Not aggressive. Not defensive. Final. Because numbers end control. Numbers define scope. And scope determines everything that comes next. They shift strategy. Because pushing harder here won't break him. It will close him. You stopped, the first detective says. Not a question. A test. His eyes narrow slightly. The first sign of something resembling disagreement.
No. Simple.
Immediate. Which means, you slowed, she adjusts. A pause. Then, yes. That's important. Because slowing implies awareness. Adjustment. Reaction to something. What changed, she asks. This time the pause is different. He doesn't answer. Not because he won't. Because this answer matters more than the others. The silence stretches. Thickens. Becomes something else entirely. And then, you did. It lands softly. But it shifts the entire room. Because you doesn't mean them. Not the detectives. The system. The world. Technology.
Surveillance.
Record keeping. The things that didn't exist when he started. You adapted, the first detective says. Yes. Moved. Yes. Changed methods. A pause. Then, refined. That word again. Refined. Not altered. Not replaced. Improved. Which means the core remained. Only the execution evolved. The room goes still. Because now the scope isn't just past. It's present. Ongoing. And that brings them back to the lot. To the woman they pulled away from him. To the moment that almost repeated itself. You are going to do it again, the second detective says. Not accusation. Fact. He doesn't deny it. Doesn't confirm it either. But his silence says enough. And in that silence, 30 years collapse into a single point. A pattern that never stopped. A process that never ended. Just adjusted. Hidden. Perfected. Until something broke. A fiber.
An alley.
A placement that didn't fit. A mistake.
And now.
A room where that mistake is finally being examined. Not as an error, but as the key. Because without it, none of this exists. Without it, he remains invisible. And the sequence continues. Unbroken. Unseen. Unstoppable.
But now.
It's none of those things. Now it has a shape. A voice. A presence sitting across the table. Answering just enough. Holding back just enough. And forcing them to understand something far worse than a confession. That what they've uncovered so far is only the part that left traces. The part that didn't work perfectly. Which means everything else, everything done without error, is still out there. Uncounted. Unseen. And buried so deep. It may never be found. Unless he decides to show them. And that decision is still entirely his. The first location didn't look like anything. That was the point. An abandoned transfer facility just outside a shipping corridor that had long since shifted routes. The building sat low against the horizon, its windows boarded, its signage peeled down to bare metal. Nothing about it drew attention. Nothing suggested history. Nothing suggested it had ever mattered. Which is exactly why it did. The warrant came through just after sunrise. By then, the sky was already bleaching the world into something flat and unforgiving. No shadows deep enough to hide in. No darkness left to soften what might be found. But inside was different. The entry team moved in slow. Not tactical urgency. Measured control. Because places like this hold silence in layers. And when you disturb them, they don't react. They reveal. The front door resisted at first. Then gave. A hollow sound echoing into space that hadn't heard movement in years. Dust lifted in the air, drifting through beams of light that cut in from broken seams in the walls. The smell hit next.
Old air.
Sealed air. Not decay. Not rot. Something cleaner. Filtered. That was the first sign. Because abandoned buildings don't smell clean. They stepped inside. Flashlights sweeping. Mapping. The main floor was empty. Or at least it looked that way. Wide open space. Concrete flooring. Rusted framework where machinery once stood. But the floor told a different story. Sections had been resurfaced. Not recently. But not original either. Patches. Subtle. Easy to miss unless you were looking for difference instead of damage. They marked them. Moved deeper. Rooms branched off from the main hall. Storage units. Offices stripped bare. Nothing left behind. Nothing obvious. Which meant everything important was hidden. They found the first door at the back.
Steel.
Reinforced. Out of place in a building that had otherwise been left to decay. No handle on the outside. Only a recessed mechanism. Controlled access. Containment. The word echoed from the interrogation room. Not held.
Contained.
This was one of those places. They forced it open. The sound didn't echo. It died quickly.
Absorbed.
The inside swallowed it. The room beyond was smaller than expected. Windowless.
Sealed.
And precise. Not makeshift. Not improvised.
Designed.
The walls were lined. Insulated. Soundproofed. The floor immaculate. Even under dust, you could see it.
No cracks. No stands. No imperfections.
Because whatever happened here was not meant to leave marks. A single chair sat in the center. Bolted down. Not for restraint. For placement. Across from it. Nothing. No table. No equipment. Just space. Enough for someone to stand. To move.
To speak.
The realization settled in slowly. This wasn't a holding cell. It was a room for interaction. Controlled environment.
No distractions. No exits. No witnesses.
A place where conversation became the only variable. And whatever he said in here
worked.
The team moved carefully. Every inch documented. Every surface scanned. And then they found it. Not in the open. Not where you'd expect. Inside the wall. A panel slightly misaligned. Barely visible. Behind it. A compartment. Sealed. Preserved. And inside. More vials. Different from the ones in the car. Older. Labeled the same way.
Dates.
Years. Stacked in sequence. The earliest. 1985. The room went still. Because that number changed everything. 1987 was never the beginning. It was already part of something in motion. Something that had started at least 2 years earlier. Maybe more. They cataloged everything. But it wasn't the vials that shook them the most. It was what came next. At the back of the compartment. A thin stack of materials. Not files. Not photographs. Something else. Paper.
Aged.
Handled.
Used. They pulled one free.
And for a moment no one spoke. Because it wasn't random. It was structured. Columns.
Notes.
Observations. Not names. Never names. Descriptions. Patterns of behavior.
Times.
Locations. Habits. It was a study, not of crimes, of people, potential, selection. He had been watching. Long before acting. Documenting. Learning. Refining. The process didn't start with the act. It started with observation, with understanding, with patience. And the room, this room, was where it all converged, where observation became interaction, where interaction became control, where control became disappearance. They moved through the rest of the building, found more rooms, some empty, some not, each one similar. Slight variations, improvements, adjustments, like iterations of a design. Each space more refined than the last, better insulated, better concealed, more efficient. He hadn't just repeated the process. He had evolved it. And each location told part of that evolution. But none of them told the whole story. Because something was missing.
No bodies.
No remains. Nothing that tied victims directly to these spaces. Which meant removal happened somewhere else. Another phase. Another location.
Another part of the sequence still hidden.
They brought the findings back. Laid them out. Cross-referenced the dates on the vials with known cases. Matches began to form. Not perfect, but close. Close enough to suggest correlation. Close enough to confirm scale. Because if each vial represented a preparation, then each one implied an interaction, an event, a person. And there were dozens. Maybe more. And that was just one location. The map expanded. Other properties tied loosely to his employment history. Facilities that fit the same profile. Underused. Transitional. Unremarkable. Each one a potential site. Each one a possibility. Search warrants multiplied.
Teams deployed.
And with each new location, the same pattern emerged. Rooms within rooms. Spaces designed not to detain, but to isolate. To remove the world. To replace it with him. And whatever he chose to say, that was the part that refused to settle. Because physical control explains action. Psychological control explains compliance. But this was something more precise. More deliberate. More practiced. And the woman from the lot, she became the key. Because she lived. Because she walked out of the sequence before it completed. And what she remembered
was almost nothing.
Fragments. A voice.
Calm.
Reassuring. Familiar in a way she couldn't explain. No threat. No fear. Just a sense that she should listen. That she already trusted him. That following him made sense. Until the lights came. Until the illusion broke. And suddenly she didn't know how she got there. That was the real method. Not force. Not even chemistry alone. It was suggestion. Amplified. Guided. Delivered in an environment where nothing contradicted it. No outside input.
No interruption.
Just his voice. And their response. The team returned to him. Back to the room. Back to the silence he understood so well.
But now,
they brought something with them. Evidence not just of action, but of structure.
Of design.
Of time. They placed the photographs on the table. The rooms.
The chair.
The vials. The notes.
He looked at them. Carefully.
Not surprised. Not impressed. Just acknowledging. Like reviewing old work. You improved, the first detective said. He nodded once. Yes.
No hesitation. No modesty.
Just fact. How many locations? The second asked. He didn't answer. But his eyes
moved.
Just slightly. Across the images. Not counting. Remembering. Because for him, these weren't scenes. They were stages. Parts of a process that had been built over years. And perfected. Except once. They placed the final image down. The alley. 1987. Black and white. Grainy. But unmistakable. The break in the pattern. The place where something didn't go as planned. He looked at it longer. The first time his attention lingered. The first time something like weight appeared behind his stillness. She wasn't supposed to be there, the detective said again. No question this time. Just a return. A reminder. A pressure point. He inhaled slowly. And for the first time since this began, he corrected them. She wasn't supposed to be seen. The room shifted. Because that changed everything. Not the location. The exposure. The risk. The failure wasn't placement. It was visibility. Something or someone had forced him to act outside the system. Outside the controlled spaces. And in doing so, he left a trace. A fiber. A thread that refused to disappear. And now, that thread had led them here. To rooms that shouldn't exist. To a system that shouldn't have worked. To a scale that shouldn't be possible. And yet,
it was.
Because for decades, it had remained exactly what it was designed to be. Invisible. Until it wasn't. And now, with every location uncovered, with every vial cataloged, with every pattern confirmed, the silence that protected it was collapsing. Layer by layer.
And beneath it,
something far larger was beginning to take shape. Something that no longer looked like a series of crimes, but a system of disappearance. Built. Tested. Refined. And hidden in plain sight. For longer than anyone had ever imagined. The system had one missing piece. They had the approach. They had the containment. They had the method. But they didn't have the end. No remains. No confirmed disposal sites. No physical link between the rooms and the disappearances beyond pattern and inference. And that absence was deliberate. Because the final stage of any sequence like this isn't just removal. It's erasure.
Total. Clean. Permanent.
The kind that leaves nothing behind except questions. And questions don't convict. They went back to the map. Not the one built from victims. The one built from him. His movements. His employment. His proximity to systems designed for one purpose. Transport. Waste.
Processing.
Places where materials enter and don't come back out in recognizable form. That was the key. Not where bodies could be hidden. Where they could be transformed. The first lead came from a facility tied loosely to one of his short-term contracts in the early 90s. Waste management. Industrial grade. Not local garbage. Not residential disposal. This was something else. Chemical processing. Breakdown. Reduction. The kind of place where organic material could be reduced to nothing that resembled what it once was. On record, the facility shut down in 1996. Environmental violations.
Finis.
Closure. Left behind. Forgotten. But the record showed something unusual. Irregular access logs. Entries outside scheduled hours. Short durations. Always signed off under supervisor override. And the supervisor was him. The warrant came fast. The site was sealed decades ago, but not secured in any meaningful way. Nature had started to reclaim it. Metal corroded. Structures weakened. But the core systems, the tanks, the processing units, they were still there.
Silent.
Waiting. The team entered with caution. Not because of immediate danger. Because of what might still remain. Air quality was tested. Stable. Barely. They moved deeper. Past rusted conveyors. Past broken control panels. Until they reached the main chamber. Large. Open. Industrial. And at its center, the tanks. Massive. Cylindrical. Connected by a network of pipes that once moved substances through stages of breakdown. Now still. But not empty. They checked the records again. Cross-referenced dates from the vials.
From the containment sites.
From his known employment periods. The alignment wasn't perfect. But it was close enough. Close enough to suggest use. Close enough to suggest that after containment, after control, after whatever happened in those rooms, they were brought here. Not to be hidden. To be removed.
Permanently.
The realization settled heavy. Because this wasn't burial. This wasn't concealment. This was elimination. They opened one of the access ports.
Carefully. Slowly.
Expecting nothing. Hoping for something. What they found wasn't immediate. No clear remains. No recognizable form. Just residue. Layered. Processed. Time-worn. But not gone. Samples were taken.
Sent to the lab.
And while they waited, they kept searching. Because systems like this don't rely on one method. They rely on redundancy. They found secondary channels. Drainage paths. Filtration systems. Places where byproducts moved. Places where something might have escaped complete breakdown. And then, in a section of the facility that had partially collapsed, they found it. A collection point. Unintended. A failure in the system. Where material had pooled instead of being fully processed. And within that, fragments. Not whole. Not identifiable at a glance. But unmistakable.
Bone.
Small pieces. Degraded. But present. The room went silent. Because this was it. The end of the sequence. The place where people stopped existing in any recoverable way. Except, not completely. Because something had gone wrong here too. A flaw. A blockage. A failure that allowed remnants to remain. Remnants that could now be tested. Matched. Linked. The lab worked fast. Faster than usual. Because now the case had crossed a line. From pattern to proof. Preliminary results came back within days. Human. Multiple individuals. Different time frames. Some dating back decades. Which meant this wasn't a single use. It was repeated. Again and again. And the system, the one they had been reconstructing, was real. Fully. Horrifyingly. Real. They returned to him. This time with something they hadn't had before. Certainty. Not complete. But enough. They placed the lab results on the table. The facility photos. The fragments. The connections. He looked at them. Longer than before. Not surprised. Not shaken. But something was there. Not emotion. Recognition of exposure. Because this part, was never meant to be seen. You built it, the first detective said. Not a question. A conclusion. He considered that. Then. No. A shift. Small. But important. You used it, the second said. Yes. There it was. The distinction. He didn't create the system. He found it. Adapted it. Integrated it into his process. Which meant there could be more. Other locations. Other systems. Other methods. Why here? The first asked. Because it works, he replied. Simple. Direct. Final. No elaboration. Because for him, that was enough. Efficiency. Effectiveness. Absence of trace. That's what mattered. You left something behind, the second said. He didn't respond. The fiber, the fragments, the mistakes. A pause. Then, yes. Again, not denial. Acknowledgement. Because the pattern wasn't perfect. It never was. It was just good enough. For long enough. Until it wasn't. How many made it here? The first asked. There it was again. The question he refused to answer. Numbers. Scale. Reality. He looked at the table. Then at them. And for the first time, he asked a question. Does it matter? The words landed differently. Not defiant. Not dismissive. Genuine. As if the number wouldn't change what had already happened. As if understanding the system was more important than counting its outcomes. And in a way, he was right. Because the number would be incomplete. Always. There would be cases that never connected. Victims that were never found. Fragments that never surfaced. The system ensured that. Designed for that. And that was the twist. The thing that reframed everything. This wasn't just about one man. It was about how easily a system designed for something else could be used for this. How the world already contained the tools. The spaces. The gaps. All he did was see them. And use them. Better than anyone had before. They pushed further. Other facilities. Other locations. Other possible disposal methods. He didn't confirm. Didn't deny. But his silence shifted. It wasn't control anymore. It was omission. Selective. Intentional. Because even now, he was choosing what remained hidden. Choosing what would never be found. And that meant, even with everything they had uncovered, the full scope would never be known. Never fully mapped. Never completely understood. Because the system was larger than him. He was just the one who used it, perfected it, turned it into something precise, something repeatable, something that could operate quietly for decades. Until a single mistake, a fiber, a placement, a moment of visibility, brought it into the light. And now, standing in that light, it didn't look like chaos. It looked like design. Cold. Measured. Terrifying in its simplicity. Because nothing about it required anything extraordinary. Just awareness, patience, and the willingness to see what others ignored. And once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. Because the world didn't change. The systems didn't disappear. The gaps didn't close. They were still there. Still functioning. Still capable. Which meant, the most unsettling part wasn't what he had done. It was how easily it could be done again. By someone else. Somewhere else. Using the same spaces. The same methods. The same silence. And that realization didn't end the case. It expanded it into something far larger than one man sitting in a room. Something that didn't have a clear boundary. Or a clear ending. Just a pattern that had finally been seen, but not fully stopped. The story didn't break all at once. It leaked. Slowly. In fragments. A line in a report that wasn't meant for public release. A mention of multiple unidentified remains buried in a document that should have stayed internal. A quiet confirmation from a source who didn't realize how much they had just revealed. And then, it spread. Not like an explosion. Like a fracture. Cracking through the surface of something the city thought it understood. Cold case reopened. Decades-old investigation linked to new suspect. Evidence suggests multiple victims. The headlines were cautious at first. Measured. Controlled. Because no one wanted to say it out loud. Not yet. But the details didn't stay contained. They never do. A photo from the facility surfaced. Grainy, distant, but unmistakable. Industrial tanks. Yellow tape. Forensic markers placed where nothing should have remained. That was enough. The tone shifted overnight. Serial pattern uncovered. Unidentified victims connected across states. Systematic disappearances under investigation. The word no one wanted to use started appearing anyway. Serial. It changed everything. Because serial means repetition. It means intention. It means time. And time means numbers. The press conference was scheduled before the investigation was ready. It had to be. Because silence was no longer possible. Too many questions. Too many eyes. The room filled early. Cameras lined up shoulder to shoulder. Reporters leaning forward, already forming the narratives they would push before the first statement was even made. Officials stepped to the podium. Faces composed. Voices steady. But beneath it, tension. Because what they were about to say wouldn't stay within those walls. We are currently investigating a series of connected cases. Careful, deliberate, spanning multiple decades. A shift in the room. Involving unidentified victims. Pen stopped. Eyes lifted. And a suspect now in custody. That was the anchor. The thing meant to reassure.
Contain. Control.
But it didn't. Because the next question came too fast. How many victims? The room held its breath. Because numbers make things real. The answer didn't come. Not directly. Multiple. A non-answer. And everyone knew it. Can you confirm this is a serial case? A pause. Measured. Yes. There it was. The word. Out loud. Official. Irreversible. And just like that, the story changed shape. It wasn't a cold case anymore.
It was a system.
One that had operated quietly, invisibly, for years. Possibly decades. The questions came faster. Were victims targeted? Why weren't these cases connected earlier? Are there more suspects involved? Is the public at risk? Each one sharper than the last. Each one cutting closer to something no one wanted to say. That this wasn't just a failure to catch someone. It was a failure to see something that had been there all along. They answered what they could. Deflected what they couldn't. Promised updates. Promised transparency. But promises don't hold back fear. And fear was already moving. Through headlines. Through screens. Through conversations that started with disbelief. And ended somewhere much darker. Because people began to realize something simple. The victims weren't random. They weren't chosen from the center of life. They were taken from the edges. People who could disappear quietly. Without immediate alarm. Which meant, for years, this had been happening in the background. Unnoticed. Unconnected. Unchallenged. That realization didn't just scare people. It unsettled them. Because it suggested something deeper. That the system didn't fail loudly. It failed silently. And silence is easy to ignore. Until it isn't. Families started coming forward. Not all at once. Not in a wave. In pieces. A missing sister from 1993. A friend who vanished in 1989. A co-worker who stopped showing up one day and was never seen again. Cases that had been filed. Forgotten. Closed without answers. Now reopened. Now questioned. Now possibly connected. The evidence team worked around the clock. DNA samples pulled from the facility. Cross-referenced against national databases. Some matches came back. Partial. Incomplete. But enough. Enough to put names where there had been none. Enough to turn absence into identity. And identity into reality. The first confirmed match changed everything. Because it wasn't just proof. It was a person. A life. A story that had been cut off and left unresolved for decades. The notification went out quietly.
No cameras.
No press. Just a knock on a door that had been closed for a long time. Answers arriving too late. But arriving. And with each identification, the weight of the case grew. Not just legally. Emotionally. Because now it wasn't theoretical. It wasn't pattern analysis or forensic mapping. It was people. And people demand accountability. The legal team began building the case.
carefully,
methodically. Because scale doesn't guarantee conviction. Evidence does. And while they had structure, they still needed direct links. Proof that tied him to each victim.
not just the system.
The acts. The prosecution strategy focused on what they could prove. The confirmed matches. The physical evidence. The containment sites. The compounds. The method. Everything that established not just presence, but intent. Because intent turns action into crime. And crime into conviction. He remained the same. Throughout.
No outbursts. No denials.
No attempts to bargain. Just that quiet, controlled presence. Watching. Listening. Waiting. As if the external noise, the media, the public, the legal pressure, didn't touch him, because in his mind, the structure was still intact. He had operated within it for decades.
And now,
even exposed, he believed it would hold. That belief became the final challenge. Not just proving what he did, but breaking the system he relied on. Showing where it failed. Where it left traces. Where it couldn't hide everything. Because without that, the narrative could shift. From certainty to doubt. And doubt is enough to fracture a case. The city responded in its own way. Not with panic. With awareness. People looked differently at spaces they had ignored before. Empty buildings.
Transitzone.
Places that existed between destinations. Between moments. Because now they understood something they hadn't before. That danger doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't always force. Sometimes. It invites. And that idea, that quiet, controlled invitation, stayed with people. Long after the headlines moved on. Long after the cameras left. Because this case didn't end with an arrest. It didn't end with a press conference. It didn't end with confirmation. It kept expanding. With every identification. With every connection. With every piece of evidence that surfaced from places no one had thought to look. And beneath all of it, one question remained. Not asked publicly. Not written in reports. But present. Constant. Unavoidable. How many are still missing? Because even with everything uncovered, everything proven, everything brought into the light, the system had been designed for one purpose: to leave nothing behind. And when something is designed that way, it succeeds more often than it fails. Which meant, for every victim they found, there could be others they never would. And that possibility, that absence, became the final weight of the case. Not what was known, but what never would be. Because some patterns, even when broken, don't reveal everything they were hiding. They just show enough to prove they existed and leave the rest in silence. The courtroom was never designed for a case like this. Courtrooms are built for facts,
dates,
evidence numbers, witness statements, a clear beginning, a clear ending. But this case had never followed a straight line. It moved through decades, through forgotten files, through abandoned buildings, through names that disappeared from records and families that waited years for answers that never came. Now, after 30 years of silence, everything had been brought into one room. The man who had spent decades avoiding attention sat less than 30 feet away from the people who had spent years searching for him. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled every available seat. Families of victims sat together, holding photographs of people who had once been missing faces on old posters and now had names again. Some carried pictures from childhood. Some carried wedding photos. Some carried nothing at all. Because for some families, the only thing they had left was the memory. And memory can become heavy when there is no ending. The prosecution opened with the evidence. Not emotion. Not speculation. Evidence. The red fiber. The vehicle records. The containment rooms. The chemical compounds. The recovered fragments. The documents. The notes. The pattern. Piece by piece, the jury was shown how something invisible became visible. How separate mysteries became connected. How a cold case from 1987 became the first crack in a structure that had existed for decades. The prosecutor placed a photograph on the screen. The alley. The same image that had been stored away for years. The same image that had once represented failure. Now it represented the beginning. This case began with one mistake, the prosecutor said. The courtroom became completely silent. One piece of evidence that was left behind. One detail that survived long enough for technology to catch up. The image changed. The fiber. Small. Almost meaningless. A thing most people would never notice. But it was enough. Enough to reopen a file. Enough to connect locations. Enough to reveal a pattern. Enough to bring a person who had hidden for decades into the light. The defense tried to break the pattern. That was their strategy. Not to explain everything. Just to create uncertainty. Because uncertainty is where cases weaken. They challenged the age of the evidence. The condition of the records. The interpretation of the patterns. They argued that connection did not always mean guilt. That similarity did not always mean responsibility. And legally, they were right to ask. A pattern is powerful. But a pattern alone is not a conviction. The prosecution knew this. That was why they focused on the details. The details that could not be explained away. The vehicle. The materials. The locations. The preserved samples. The testimony of the surviving woman. She entered the courtroom quietly.
No dramatic entrance. No anger.
Just a person who had survived something she still struggled to understand. She described the night she was found. The meeting. The conversation. The strange calm she felt. The way everything seemed normal until suddenly. It wasn't. I remember his voice, she said. The room listened. Not the words, just the voice. She paused. It sounded safe. That sentence affected everyone. Because that was the part that disturbed investigators the most. The method wasn't built on fear. It was built on trust. False trust. Manufactured trust. The defense questioned her memory. Asked about confusion. Asked about stress. Asked whether she could truly identify someone after such a long and traumatic event. She answered carefully. Because she understood something. This wasn't about remembering every second. It was about remembering enough. And sometimes, enough is what remains. The prosecution then introduced the evidence from the abandoned facilities. Images appeared one after another. Rooms. Chairs. Hidden compartments. Organized records. The defense objected. The judge allowed the evidence. Because the locations were not being presented as proof of every individual crime. They were being presented as proof of method. Intent. Preparation. Planning. The courtroom watched as the picture became clearer.
This was not a spontaneous act.
Not a moment of uncontrolled violence. It was structured, repeated, maintained. A system. And systems require decisions. The most damaging testimony came from the forensic specialists. They explained the compounds, the materials, the recovered fragments, the connections between locations and timelines. The science spoke calmly, without anger, without emotion. That was what made it powerful. Because science doesn't need to shout. It only needs to show. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The defendant would speak. Not because he had to. Because he chose to. For years, he had controlled every conversation. Every answer. Every silence. The courtroom wondered if this would be different. He walked to the stand.
Slowly.
The same measured movement investigators had noticed from the beginning.
No urgency.
No fear. He looked older now. But the same. Controlled. Detached. The prosecutor began. You knew these investigations existed. Yes. You knew evidence was being collected. Yes. You knew investigators were getting closer. Yes. The answers came easily. Almost too easily. You understood what you were doing was wrong? A pause. Longer. The first real hesitation. Then, I understood what people believed was wrong. A wave moved through the courtroom. Not noise. Reaction. The prosecutor continued. You're saying you don't believe what you did was wrong? Another pause. I'm saying belief changes depending on perspective. That answer revealed something everyone already suspected. He wasn't denying. He was separating himself. Creating distance between action and morality. The prosecutor placed one final photograph in front of him. The unidentified woman from 1987. The woman who started everything. The woman whose name had finally been restored. The prosecutor asked one question. Do you remember her?
For the first time.
The room waited. Not for evidence. Not for facts. For something human. A reaction. Anything. His eyes stayed on the photograph. Seconds passed. Then more. Yes. The answer was quiet. But everyone heard it. Why her? The question remained hanging. Because that was the question that had survived for decades. Why her? Why that night? Why that place? His answer came slowly. She changed the pattern. The courtroom went still. Not because it was surprising. Because it confirmed what they already knew. The mistake. The deviation. The moment the system failed. The prosecutor leaned forward. And the others? A pause. The others followed the pattern. That sentence would become the defining moment of the trial. Because it was not a confession in the traditional sense. It was something colder. An acknowledgement. A confirmation that, in his mind, this was not a series of crimes. It was a process. The jury left with thousands of pages of evidence. Weeks of testimony. Decades of unanswered questions. And when they returned, the verdict was expected. But expectation doesn't make it easier. The courtroom was silent as the foreperson stood. The defendant showed no reaction. The families did. Some cried. Some closed their eyes. Some simply sat still. Because justice does not erase time. It does not return years. It does not bring people back. It only creates an answer where there was once only a question. After the verdict, reporters surrounded the courthouse. The story dominated headlines. A 30-year cold case solved. A hidden system exposed. Victims identified. A city forced to confront something it never saw coming. But beyond the headlines, beyond the cameras, the real story remained with the families. The people who waited. The people who wondered. The people who kept photographs in drawers because letting go felt impossible. The investigation had ended. But the impact had not. Because the most disturbing truth about the case was not that someone had hidden for decades. It was that the world around him had allowed the silence to continue. A missing person report. An unidentified body. A forgotten file. Each one separate. Each one smaller than it should have been. Until someone finally connected them. And that connection changed everything. The red fiber. The smallest clue. The one thing that survived. It proved that no matter how carefully someone builds a system, no matter how much they believe they have erased, something always remains. A trace. A memory. A question waiting to be answered. And sometimes, that single piece is enough. Enough to reopen the past. Enough to reveal the truth. Enough to finally give a voice back to those who were silenced. Because every cold case is not just a file. Not just evidence. Not just a mystery. It is someone who was loved. Someone who was missed. Someone whose story deserved to be finished. And after 30 years, this story finally had its ending. The verdict closed the courtroom doors. But it did not close the case. Because some investigations end with a conviction. Others continue living in the questions they leave behind. This was one of those cases. The headlines eventually changed. They always do. A story that once dominated every screen slowly moved downward, replaced by newer tragedies, newer scandals, newer fears. But for the families, time did not move the same way. For them, the case never became history. It remained personal. A name. A face. A person who had once walked through ordinary streets believing there would always be another tomorrow. The investigation had uncovered the system. It had exposed the method. It had revealed the man behind decades of silence. But investigators knew something that the public struggled to accept. A solved case does not always mean a complete truth. Because truth has layers. And some layers remain buried. Even after an arrest. Even after a conviction. The first review began immediately after the trial. Every file connected to him was reopened. Every unexplained disappearance examined again. Every unidentified victim compared against the evidence recovered from the facilities. The process was enormous. Because the scale of the operation had stretched across years, states, and forgotten records. Thousands of names were reviewed. Thousands of reports were pulled from archives. Some had been untouched for decades. Dust-covered folders containing stories that had almost disappeared. A missing person report from a small town. A photograph attached to a police bulletin. A family's last known memory. A sentence written by an investigator who never knew the importance of what they recorded. All of it was examined again. This time with different eyes. Because the question had changed. Before, investigators asked, "Who is this person?" Now they asked, "Could this person have crossed his path?" And that question opened doors nobody expected. Several cases were connected. Not every disappearance. Not every mystery. But enough. Enough to show that the system had reached further than anyone first understood. Some victims were identified through DNA. Others through old dental records. Others through simple details that had been overlooked for years. A piece of jewelry. A childhood injury. A photograph found in an old family album. Small things. Human things. The kind of details that remind investigators that behind every file number was a life. Not evidence. Not a statistic. A life. The first confirmed identities brought complicated emotions. Relief.
Pain.
Anger.
Peace.
All at once. Families finally received answers. But answers can hurt. Because sometimes the truth you spend years searching for is not the truth you hope to find. A mother who had waited 30 years finally learned what happened to her daughter. A brother who had kept searching finally had a place to visit. A family that had lived between hope and grief finally had certainty. But certainty is not the same as happiness. It never was. Meanwhile, investigators continued examining the man himself. Not just what he did, but how he remained hidden. That became one of the most important questions of the entire investigation. How does someone disappear in plain sight? The answer was uncomfortable. Because he did not look like a monster. He did not behave like the image people expected. He had no obvious signs. No dramatic public behavior. No history that warned everyone around him. He worked. He paid bills. He maintained routines. He existed quietly. And that was the part that disturbed people the most. Because evil rarely announces itself. Sometimes it arrives wearing the face of normal life. The investigation also revealed something else. The importance of time. The case was not solved because one person suddenly confessed. It was solved because decades of technology eventually caught up with decades of evidence. The fiber that once meant nothing became a connection. The records that once seemed useless became a map. The locations that once looked abandoned became pieces of a larger design. Time had been his protection. But eventually, time became the thing that exposed him. The world changed around him. Technology advanced. Databases expanded. Science improved. The things that did not exist in 1987 eventually became the reason 1987 could finally be understood. And that became the final lesson of the case. A cold case is never truly cold. Not completely. Evidence waits. Families remember. Questions remain. And somewhere, something always survives. Months after the trial ended, investigators returned one final time to the original location. The alley was gone. The warehouse was gone. The walls that had surrounded the first discovery no longer existed. The city had replaced it. New buildings. New streets. New people walking above a place where something terrible had happened decades earlier. Most of them would never know. They would pass through without thinking. And maybe that was fitting. Because the victim had once been invisible too. Until someone finally looked closely enough. Investigators stood there quietly. Not as detectives. Not as officials. As people. Because behind all the evidence, all the reports, all the courtroom arguments, there was still one simple fact. Someone had been lost there. Someone had deserved to be found. And finally, she was. The detective who reopened the file years later would later say the thing he remembered most was not the evidence. Not the arrest. Not the trial. It was the moment they placed the old photograph on the table and realized the case was no longer about a mystery. It was about a person. A person who had waited decades for someone to speak for her. That was the moment everything changed. Because investigations can become consumed by patterns, by methods, by numbers. But justice begins with individuals. One person, one story, one life. And that was why the red fiber mattered. Not because it caught a criminal, because it led back to someone who had been forgotten. Someone whose name had disappeared. Someone whose final moments had been controlled by another person. But whose story was eventually taken back. The man responsible would spend the rest of his life behind walls he could not leave. The system he built was destroyed. The locations were closed. The evidence preserved. The records updated. The silence was broken. But the case left behind a warning. A reminder that the darkest secrets are not always hidden in impossible places. Sometimes they exist in ordinary spaces. Behind normal routines. Inside systems people trust. Waiting. Patiently. Until someone notices the smallest inconsistency. A detail that doesn't belong. A question that refuses to disappear. A piece of evidence that survives longer than anyone expected. That was what happened in New York. A forgotten case from 1987. A cold case that sat untouched. A mystery that seemed destined to remain unanswered. Until one piece of buried evidence changed everything. The world often remembers cases because of the people responsible. But the real reason they matter is because of the people who were lost. The people who deserved more than a file number.
More than a headline.
More than silence. And after decades of uncertainty, the silence finally ended. Not because the past changed. It couldn't.
The years were still gone.
The pain was still real. The losses were still permanent. But because someone finally looked back. Someone finally connected the pieces. Someone finally understood that even the smallest trace can carry the weight of an entire story. And sometimes, the smallest clue is the one that brings the greatest truth. Because no matter how carefully something is buried, no matter how much time passes, no matter how many years a secret survives, the past has a way of returning. And when it does, it remembers everything.